Our Old Testament reading this morning is found in Exodus chapter 24, verses 12 through 18. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Come up to me on the mountain, stay there, and I will give you the tablets of stone on which I have inscribed the instructions and commands so you can teach the people." So Moses and his assistant Joshua set out, and Moses climbed up the mountain of God. Moses told the elders, "Stay here and wait for us until we come back. Aaron and Hur are here with you. If anyone has a dispute while I am gone, consult with them." Then Moses climbed up the mountain, and the cloud covered it. And the glory of the Lord settled down on Mount Sinai, and the cloud covered it for 6 days. On the seventh day, the Lord called to Moses from inside the cloud. To the Israelites at the foot of the mountain, the glory of the Lord appeared at the summit like a consuming fire. Then Moses disappeared into the cloud as he climbed higher up the mountain. He remained on the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights. And our gospel reading is found in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 17, verses 1 through 9. 6 days later, Jesus took Peter and the two brothers, James and John, and led them up a high mountain to be alone. As the men watched, Jesus' appearance was transformed so that his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as light. Suddenly Moses and Elijah appeared and began talking with Jesus. Peter exclaimed, "Lord, it's wonderful for us to be here. If you want, I'll make 3 shelters as memorials, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." But even as he spoke, a bright cloud overshadowed them, and a voice from the cloud said, "This is my dearly loved Son, who brings me great joy. Listen to him." The disciples were terrified and fell face down on the ground. Then Jesus came over and touched them. "Get up," he said. "Don't be afraid." And when they looked up, Moses and Elijah were gone, and they saw only Jesus. As they went back down the mountain, Jesus commanded them, "Don't tell anyone what you have seen until the Son of Man has been raised from the dead." May the Lord bless the reading of his word. So, this morning, I want you to start by thinking about symbols. And to do that, I want you to take a look at the artwork that's up in the church. This is our Advent and Christmas artwork. There's banners, there's hangings, there's the Advent banners, there's a banner over there. And I want you to take a look, because you're not going to get to see them for the rest of the year, because the tradition that Kim and I have is we put the art up for Advent and leave it up until the beginning of Lent. And for Lent, we'll take all the artwork down as a reminder that Lent is a time of preparation and a time of giving things up, a time of a special dedication that prepares us for Easter and what Easter stands for and what Easter means to us. And we'll talk about that more because, next week and the next several weeks, because we'll be in that season. But as we look at the art, and even, for those of you who can turn all the way around, there's our stained glass window at the back. I want to remind people that art is symbols. And it means different things to different people as they look at it and as they think about it. And it evokes different emotions and different reactions in people. And to some people, they'll see a piece of art and it doesn't really do much for them at all, right? To some people, it's like, "Ugh, I don't like that." And to other people, it may remind them of something and make them feel happy. To other people, it may be encouraging or enlightening. To art can be it can be inspiring. It can be confusing. It can even be obnoxious or it can be challenging to people. And really, artists create art sometimes to challenge or even in some ways offend people, because they want to get us to stop and think about what it is that they're portraying or communicating. And when we communicate in art, and as an artist, I'm aware of this, when we do this, we're communicating in symbol. We're communicating in it's images and things that sometimes are obvious and sometimes aren't. Sometimes they mean something to me as the artist, and they'll mean something completely different to the person who sees it. And one of the challenges as an artist is that you create something that you think obviously means this great idea or thing, and someone else comes along and sees it, and they think something completely different. And once you've created a piece of art and put it up for people to see, it's out of your hands, right? Other people will see and interpret the way that they choose to. I'd like to know what people think that stained glass window is, because for years I've looked at that window and I have my idea of what it was supposed to be, but it's kind of abstract, right? It's cubism or something like that. And I don't know if anybody's ever thought, you've sat here every week. Have you ever given that any thought? I noticed a lot of people turn around and looked at it. People who've been here and seen it hundreds of thousands of times. It's just there, and we don't think about it much, right?
Stained plastic.
Sorry?
Stained plastic.
Stained plastic. Actually, you know what? I think the panels are glass. It's the trim is plastic. It's not the lead. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. To me, it looks like two people praying, with a cross in the middle, except they have these big Pope-type hats or turbans. They could be turbans with feathers sticking out of them. It's kind of weird. Anyway, what is all that about, right? It's about the idea that symbols are powerful. Images are powerful. And our story this morning is one that you're familiar with. It's called the Transfiguration, right? The Transfiguration of Jesus. But see, there's a word there, transfiguration, that really is a word we don't usually use. And because we don't usually use it, and we only really use it in the Bible for this story, or that's where we would most often be familiar with it, we attach different meaning to it, or we attach extra meaning to it than what the original words actually meant to the author, probably. Because in the Greek, the word would be the root of metamorphosis. So it's metamorpho or something like that in the Greek. And in the New Testament, that word, that actual Greek word, is used about 4 times. At least 2 of those times are to describe the story we read this morning, what we call the Transfiguration. And in a lot of Bibles, in most Bibles, according to English Bibles, according to the little bit of research I did, it gets translated transfigured, or transfigured. You'll note in our translation this morning, it was translated as transformed. Transformed would be a more modern, contemporary English word for the Greek. In fact, even in your NIVs and your KJVs and all the other ones that translate that word as transfigured in this morning's passage, in the other passages in which it is used in the New Testament, primarily not primarily, solely, I think, in Paul's letters, and there's one of his letters, and you'll be familiar with the verse, "Be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind." I think I did that in the KJV, which translates the exact same word, transformed instead of transfigured. If they were consistent, they would have said, "Be ye transfigured." So why would the translators translate that word transfigured instead of transformed? Partly because of this whole idea of symbolism and imagery. Because in the story that follows, we have some very strong imagery of what it meant, or what it means, or what we're supposed to receive as a story of Jesus' transformation as he went up the mountain. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute, but I want to cover some of the other symbolism. So there's some symbolism that the translators may be attaching to a word because of the context of the story. But what we might miss is all of the symbolism that the writer, Matthew, has put into the story that his audience would have seen as obvious symbolism in his story. It starts with 6 days later. I don't know if you noticed, in the passage you read from the Old Testament, Moses goes up onto the mountain to receive the law. This is like the most important historical point in the history of the Israelite people, right? They have been freed from slavery, they've come into the wilderness, and God meets with them in the wilderness, and he gives them his instructions for how that they will be a kingdom or a nation that is ruled by God, and that will live in a way that will bring them blessings. And last week we read the passage in the Old Testament where it said, choose, to stay who you'll serve, and will you have blessings or will you have curses because of following my law? And this week's reading is about Moses going up to the mountain and receiving the law. And this story of Moses going up on the mountain is the story of the greatest prophet in the history of Israel. the prophet Moses, who took the people out of slavery and who received the law and gave it to the people and who kept them together until it was time to go into the kingdom, and who, because of his own weakness, didn't get to go in there himself. And this is the prophet Moses, who some people, traditionally at the time of Jesus, aren't sure whether he really did die, even though it says he died, but it says nobody saw him die. And it says that he was in good health up until the day he died, that God just said it's time, and that God himself buried him is the tradition because there was nobody there to bury him, right? Anyway, this is the great prophet Moses who goes up to the mountain, and the mountain is covered in a cloud and in a bright light for 6 days. And on the seventh day, God speaks to Moses. And our story this morning starts out with 6 days later, right? And what is it 6 days later from? Well, if you look back in your Bible, it's 6 days later from a couple of very important things that happened. Jesus asks his disciples, who is everybody saying that I am? Right? Well, you're a prophet. You're Elijah. These are the things that the people are saying. And then Jesus says, well, who do you say I am? And Peter, of course, this is classic Peter, just pipes up and says, you're the Son of God. Right? And Jesus says, on this truth, I will build my church. Now, the church likes to argue. People in the church like to argue about whether he's saying he's going to build it on that truth or whether he's going to build it on Peter. And I would say my teaching here this morning would be that it's both, that you should read it as both, that Jesus is endorsing Peter as the beginning of his church, or one of the leaders, the important leaders of the church. And we see it after the resurrection. We see Jesus saying, feed my sheep, feed my sheep. Right? He's giving that commission to Peter. But that's not what the most important thing here. The most important thing is that we have this big moment where Peter recognizes, and does he really recognize, but where he states, and this happens throughout the God story, right? Where us humans will say things that are truer than we have any idea what they are, right? And I believe that's what Peter is doing. Because only moments later, Jesus starts talking about his death on the cross. And Peter's like, that can't happen. No way. And Jesus is like, that's from Satan. Go away with that. That's Peter, right? It's straight out whatever's on his mind comes out right away. But what we have 6 days earlier is this confession of Christ's special relationship to God the Creator, of Jesus' sonship. And now, 6 days later, they go up a mountain. There's the other symbolism, right? So there's the 6 days later, and there's a mountain. And then we're going to have actually Moses and Elijah, their symbols. Moses, I've already talked about, is a symbol of the great prophet, the one who brings them out of slavery. Elijah is the other great prophet who didn't die, right? And we know Elijah didn't die because he gets taken up by a chariot of fire, right? And he's just taken to God. That's Elijah. This is the prophet who prays and fire comes down from heaven, right? He's a great prophet. Excuse me. And because he was taken up, and because of a passage in the Old Testament, one of the prophets, it says that Elijah will return, and it doesn't quite say it in those words, but it basically paves the way for the belief that Elijah must return before the Messiah can come. It says that he must return before the Messiah can come. And that's why Jesus talks about John the Baptist as being Elijah. He says, for those who will receive him. And that's why that's why when we talk about John the Baptist, we talk about how he looks and acts like Elijah, because that's a fulfillment, right? So here they are, Jesus' three closest friends. And he brings them up a mountain, which is important, right? They're going up a mountain to be alone. That's a spiritual journey. 6 days later, they go up the mountain. There's, before the cloud, before Moses and Elijah, Jesus is transformed, right? And that transformation, when we use that word transfigured, we get caught up in a lot of religious symbolism that we don't even really understand, because this is a moment of mystery, right? And we're not given a lot of details. But here's the details we're given. And I'm going to come back to this more than once, but the details we're given are what they see, right? And I started off talking about artwork and symbolism because what we take in with our eyes, what we see, often means things that we can't put into words. It evokes emotions and responses that are deep within us. And so the three friends are standing there, and Jesus starts to glow. He glows. And we're not talking about, the pregnant woman, she's glowing. He's actually glowing like a light bulb, right? And it gets a lot more than that. I love this translation that we read this morning. His face shines like the sun. I guess they couldn't look at him, right? Like if his face was shining like the sun, they'd be like, oh, wow, that hurts. I've got spots in my eyes. And his clothes were like as bright as light, I think is how the translation said it this morning. That's amazing. Bright as light. I love that translation. Try to imagine his clothes are glowing like a light bulb and his face is as bright as the sun. They probably weren't looking at him directly, but what kind of an experience is that for three guys that have seen Jesus doing miracles? They've seen him doing amazing things, but prophets do amazing things, right? The Messiah would do amazing things, but what is the Messiah? Well, 6 days earlier, Peter says he's the Son of God, but all of the people of Israel are the children of God, right? So what does that mean? It can mean a lot of things. We know what it means to us a couple thousand years later because we've had time to look at these passages and think about them and talk about them and argue about them. But what they're seeing is something out of this world. That's the best way to describe it. It is beyond human experience for them to see a man glowing like the sun, blindingly bright. The veil between our reality and the other reality is opened. When Christ is baptized, in some of the Gospels, the term that's used, it says that the skies or the heavens are torn apart. Well, I don't think the writer here wants us to envision a tearing, but instead the glory of the kingdom of God, the glory of where God somehow resides, shines through Jesus. And for a few moments, these three men have entered the very real presence of the living God in a way that no one ever has. Maybe Moses has had a similar experience. Probably Moses had a similar experience. He was on the mountain. There was this bright light. There was like fire. There was all kinds of stuff. And God let Moses see enough of him that he came down from the mountain glowing, right? Shining. Another symbolism, right? Where Matthew, the writer, telling us this story, wants us to see that there is a connection between Jesus and Moses. Except that Jesus is so far greater than Moses that his clothes glow and his face is as bright as the sun. And just in case we're not sure that Jesus is greater than Moses and Elijah, they show up and chat with him. Right? In another gospel, it says they talk about his exodus, about Jesus' exodus, his leaving of our planet, right? So they're talking about after the resurrection. And Peter, and I read this story this week, and I studied on it, and I thought, we give Peter an awfully hard time. For being the brave one, for being the one that actually stands up and waves his hands in the air when the Spirit moves him. I feel bad when I think badly of Peter for that, because really, he's a lot braver than me. He's a lot more open to the Spirit than me. And Peter pipes up and says, "This is amazing. Do you want me to build some shelters for you and the other guys, these great prophets, as a memorial?" You know what? For years, Christians have talked about, what does this mean? What is Peter talking about? We have nothing that really gives us a good idea of what in the world was going on in Peter's mind, right? We talk about the Feast of Tabernacles, where the Israelites would come to Jerusalem and they'd build shelters because it was like a music festival. It was a camp out, right? So you build these little tent shelter thingies so that you could stay at Jerusalem and celebrate and stuff. They talk about whether it was supposed to be like altars or something, and because of the way the other gospel talks about the way that it frames the story of what Peter does here, we tend to view his reaction in a negative light. But we're not reading the other gospel this morning. We're reading Matthew's gospel. And I want you to see what Matthew has written about Peter. He's excited. Jesus is glowing like the sun, and the prophets have shown up, and Peter is excited. So excited he wants to do something, but he doesn't know what to do. So he says the first thing that comes to his mind. I'm going to build some shelters, and it'll be like a memorial to this amazing thing that's going on here. And you know what? Good on you, Peter. Right? You got excited. That's what we're supposed to get when we read this passage. We should be getting excited. Something amazing is going on here. And in case we're not sure, God shows up. Not just in the glowing, but in the cloud. Right? There's a bright cloud that overshadows everything. Go back to your Old Testament reading. What happens at the mountain? The cloud shows up. The cloud often represents God's presence or his spirit. In the Old Testament, in some of the prophets, when they're viewing heaven, right, where God's throne is, it talks about the heavenly temple being filled with smoke or cloud, and it represents God's presence or the presence of God's spirit. And over again, when God shows up in the story of Moses, it's as a pillar of fire or a cloud, and on the mountain there's the cloud and fire, and it's a representation, it's a symbol. Remember, we're talking about symbols this morning? It's a symbol of God's presence because, as God tells Moses, if you saw God face to face, it would kill you, apparently. God's true presence is too powerful for our brains to process. So what we get to see is a bright cloud. And this cloud envelops them. And the disciples, the three friends, the three close followers of Jesus, what do? They're smart. They prostrate themselves on the ground. That's, when you read, they bow down on the ground. It isn't like, they get down on their knees and, they're laying flat on the ground with their faces in the dirt because they're in the presence of holiness. And not just holiness, not like we think of holiness. They're in the presence of the power of God. A scary, awesome power. And it is so real to them. And it is real, right? But we talk about the awesomeness of God. We talk about the mightiness or the power or the glory. But part of the reason that we don't all experience it the way that they experienced it is because we live in a world where we don't believe in that kind of thing. Or at least we believe that there's a separation between us and the spiritual kingdom of God that doesn't really exist. It doesn't really exist. But because we're so secular in our thinking, because we live in a world that's been formed by science and by technology, we're skeptical. And skepticism is a good thing quite often, and especially in the world we live in, because we're inundated with crap that has no truth to it at all. And we're constantly trying to be sold something, and we have to learn skepticism just to be able to survive. But that skepticism, it affects all of our life. And the world we live in takes away, the vernacular would be that it robs us of the magic of our world, right? But as Christians, as people who understand and have a relationship with the creator of the universe, what often is called magic, we have other words for it. We call it spiritual. We call it ephemeral. We call it, but you know what? It's the magic. It is that which you cannot see or touch or smell with your hands and your physical senses all the time. It's an invisible world that sometimes breaks into ours, but is always here. It's always here. And you see, that's why artists create art, right? Because they're trying, either because they feel a connection to that invisible world and they're trying to give us images to explain that, or because they're searching for a connection to the invisible world, and we create as artists images that we hope will bridge the gap between what we believe or what we feel exists, but we don't always see it on a day-to-day basis. And the disciples, those three men, are lying on the dirt on their faces in the middle of an experience of what exists all around us, but we don't always get to see. And it's just blaring through in Jesus' face and clothes, and in the presence of the prophets, and in God's cloud, glowing cloud, and then God speaks. And of course, the author, the writer Matthew, wants to see the experience of God on the mountain at Sinai, but he also wants us to remember that God showed up when Jesus was baptized and said almost the very same thing. This is my son with whom I am well pleased. And in our translation this morning, he says, this is my son whom I'm really happy with. And I think I've probably paraphrased even, but I like the feel of our translation this morning. I love my son. This is the son I love. Listen to him. Listen to him. And then they look up, and it's all gone. It's all gone. For how many minutes? How long were they in this presence of glory? We don't know, right? Because, we just have the words that describe it, and it happens pretty quick in a narrative sense. But it was long enough for two prophets to show up and have a bit of a conversation with Jesus, apparently. It was long enough for Peter to offer to build shelters. And the climax, was when God shows up and speaks. And during that, they're on the ground with their faces in the dirt. And Jesus has to come over and touch them. This is a beautiful part in Matthew's story. It doesn't take place in the other gospel where it's described. Jesus comes over and he touches them. This is so Jesus, right? I read that and I think of the story where the lepers come to Jesus and he touches them to heal them. Nobody touches lepers, right? It's a contagious disease. You're not supposed to touch them. For a Jewish person, you become unclean just by the fact of touching them, but you can also become diseased with a disease that will cut you off from your society, right? But Jesus touches. If you've ever come into the church and had someone like Linda come up and hug you, that's the emotion I feel when I read about Jesus going over and laying his hand on his friend's shoulders and saying, "Get up. It's okay. You can get up now. It's gone. It's safe." They've been in the presence of something amazing and spectacular. And this morning, I've told you some of the symbolism and stuff, and I've tried to connect how I hope you can, or we can, engage in a story like this. But what I want you to do for right now is just take a few moments and think. Maybe even close your eyes and try to picture Jesus standing there with his face shining brighter than the sun. His clothes so bright that they glow like light. And sit there for just a moment or two, seeing that amazing, unbelievable, scary image in front of you, burning the outline of Jesus into your retinas the way it does, so that when you open your eyes, you'll be blinking and there'll be this blue kind of image. Think about it. Standing in Jesus' presence with him flaring like a sun. This world that's described in our passage this morning is real. It's present even now. And maybe we don't get to experience it in the way that those three men got to experience it. But I'm encouraging you to seek the experience of it in whatever ways work for you. For some of us, it's music. For me, it's art. For some of us, it's stories. For some of us, it's the scriptures themselves. Find translations that make that story new to you. Read a different translation. If you've been reading the same translation your entire life or for the last 4 years or whatever, go get a different Bible. Get a really modern translation. Get a paraphrase even. What a horrible thing for the pastor to say, right? No, get a paraphrase even. Because I'm not encouraging you to read it for theology. I'm encouraging you to read it so that you'll have fresh eyes. Many years ago, I'm going on a sidetrack here, but many years ago, my father-in-law, who was a pastor, a Free Methodist pastor, introduced my wife and I to the Message. It's a paraphrase by Eugene Peterson, who is a pastor himself. And it was a very kind of modern, vernacular kind of paraphrase. So much so that now some of the passages are a little awkward. Some of them are a lot awkward because it has a bit of that, California feel to it almost. And I read a little bit of it, and you know what I did back many years ago when I would look at a translation and see what I thought of it. I always went to John 1:1 and read the first, that beautiful prologue of John. If it didn't come across as beautifully as the versions I was used to, I wasn't interested. And I read that and I thought, yeah, it's too loosey to me, for me. And for many years I ignored it. And then years later, and this is while I was attending this church, I think we did it as a church, or there was a small group in the church that did something called Purpose-Driven Life. And there was a devotional book that went along with it. And I read the devotional book, and I was reading it, and the guy that did the devotional book would quote scripture, and he quoted tons of scripture. But the thing he did was he quoted it from all kinds of translations and paraphrases. And a lot of them were like sort of modern or different paraphrases, like the Message. And he quoted a lot of the Message. And every time I would come across one of these quotes and I'd read something that I just did not recognize. It's like, that's not what I remember the Bible saying. And it was all footnoted, which I really appreciated. I'd flip to the back of the book and I'd look up the footnote and I'd see what translation it was. And I kept coming across the Message. And I kept coming across the way that it was so fresh and different. The meaning that hit me when he would quote a certain passage from that paraphrase, so much so that I decided I was going to start reading that paraphrase again. And I read through. I started by reading through the New Testament, and one of my coworkers thought there was something weird going on because at lunch I'd be sitting there with two Bibles open, reading them, and I was reading the Message and comparing it to I don't know whether it was the NASB or the NIV at the time, but just because I would keep reading these things and they sounded so different that I had to compare them. And the more I did, the more I realized, it's not that different. It's just it sounds different. It makes me form different images in my head. And all that I said just because I want to encourage you. If you want to experience a little bit more of that invisibleness, change it up. Find a translation or a paraphrase that's in a more a different level of English than what you're used to. Maybe a more vernacular, just a more modern English. But make sure it's a lot different, not just an updated version of what you've been used to. And you'll find that things are new. There's a new look to it, and different images come to your mind. And we're image-driven people. Right? Our brains are constructed in such a way that our thoughts are in images. We're symbolic. Everything is symbolic in the way our brain works. And the story this morning is so full of symbols. It's all about symbols. And I guess I believe that the one truth I might leave with you this morning would be that Jesus somehow transcends symbol and becomes the living symbol of God among us. Somehow he is both the image and the thing. C.S. Lewis says the beautiful thing about Jesus is that he's myth, but he's the real myth. He's mythological in the sense that he is bigger than life, but it's real. That's what this story of transformation or transfiguration, I guess, brings to me this morning, is that Jesus becomes light in the presence of his friends, and it somehow symbolizes that Jesus is more than just a representation of God. He is both the representation and the presence of God right there on that mountain. And he wants to be that every day to us. And in doing so, it isn't just about all the things that we've learned in Sunday school and growing up in the church and stuff. It's also about experiential, symbolic. That light shining out of Jesus' face, he wants you to experience that too. And so I encourage you this morning to seek out some experience that will renew that experience for you if you've had it before, or maybe make it a brand new one for you. The spiritual realm is beautiful and awesome, and it is supposed to be connected to our lives through Jesus and his Holy Spirit. It's what we've been offered. And sometimes we forget that and we get disconnected. And the story this morning of the transfiguration, the transformation of Jesus, is an invitation to reconnect with that amazing world that is beyond us and beyond ours. And what a perfect place to be as we look forward towards Lent and towards preparation for Easter. Let's pray. Jesus, I'm envious of your friends. I wonder whether the other members of the 12 were envious when they came back and told the story. I wonder about everyone else that didn't go up that mountain. What a burden those 3 guys had to carry. And then you told them to keep it secret. But dear Jesus, we are thankful that we no longer must keep the secret, and we are thankful that you have promised to be real and present in our lives. And so I ask you, Jesus, I ask you for everyone here this morning, that you would be present. Break down even just a little bit of the barrier between us and your world of light. Fill us somehow with that light, that beautiful, amazing, divine light, which lit your face up like the sun. And may we shine a little bit more like you for the people around us that need that light, Lord. In a world that is often hard and oppressive and dark, somehow bring us into your presence and fill us with your light so that we might take that light into other people's darkness. This morning we ask that you would transform us by the presence of your light in our lives. In Jesus' precious name.